welcome to this podcast, The Good Congress. I'm Brad Fitch, your host, walking you through a series of interviews with experts on Congress and democracy. The goal here is to help identify the principles and paths to a good Congress, explore strategies and proposals to improve congressional operations and outcomes, and hopefully build greater trust in American democratic institutions. Let's get started with today's topic and guest. Today's topic is going to be on civility and collaboration. And we could find no better expert in the field than Bruce Patton, who's here with us today. Welcome, Bruce.
Hey, thank you for having me, Brad.
Let me give you a little background on Bruce, but then he's going to talk a little bit more about his background. Bruce teaches at Harvard University in Negotiation Workshop. He is the co-author of Getting to Yes. If you're not familiar with Getting to Yes, it's one of the most famous management books on negotiation ever written, translated into 36 different languages, 15 million copies sold. He's a pioneer of teaching the art of negotiation, and he's also the co-author of Difficult Conversations, How to Discuss What Matters Most. He also was a consultant and advisor to the Select Committee on Modernization, one of the most successful collaborative efforts in the United States Congress in the last 50 years. And I'm going to draw him out a little bit to talk a little bit about his experience in working with the Select Committee. Bruce, I want to start in an area not in the United States, but in other nations. You've had a fascinating journey in the art of negotiations with other nations, including South Africa, the Middle East. Could you tell us a little bit about those experiences and what they might have taught you about how governments can function better?
Yeah, I started my career with my colleague and mentor, Roger Fisher, who went back and forth between theory and practice and worked on sort of track two diplomacy in a series of international conflicts for years and years, decades, and batted much closer to 1,000 than 500 in terms of it was absolutely astonishing. Let me tell you two stories. One is, when Iran took American diplomats hostage in 1979, which, by the way, has come to mind a lot lately because the U.S. Agency for International Development is, not in high respect, held in high respect by the Trump administration, who's trying to get rid of it. And yet my memories, immediately went to President Carter at the beginning of his term saying, we're giving money to the mullahs in Iran, to keep them quiet. That's immoral. We shouldn't be spending, aid money to do that. We should be helping, And so he got rid of it. And a year later, he had to deal with the consequences of that. They had a revolution in Iran, and then they took American diplomats hostage. And the truth is, a lot of that aid money is doing things that are good for us, even if we don't always say that, because, Anyway, so the day these hostages were taken, Anthony Lewis of the New York Times, who was then the foreign affairs correspondent, called up Roger Fisher, and I was in the office, and we were talking about it, and he said, Roger, how many hours do you think this is going to continue? And Roger said, well, we just did an analysis, and our best guess is about 13 months. Right? And Lewis said, are you out of your mind? How could this possibly do that? And said, well, if you put yourself in the other side's shoes, this is really good for the Ayatollah Khomeini, who is the nominal head of the revolution, but is currently not in control of the civil government. And he's using this as a cudgel against them. And he's going to like that. And the second thing you have to think about is, where is there a deadline that would lead people make decisions on deadlines because things are going to get worse. And you look at it and you think the time when you think you're going to get the best deal is right before the presidential election in about, right, in another year. And he said, oh, you're insane. And he said, and the third thing is we looked at the nearest analog we could find, and that was when North Korea seized the U.S. spy ship, the Pueblo, and kept its crew for 11 months. He said,
Yep.
you're insane. You're insane. And as we all remember, or some of us weren't born, but that crisis not only went through the election, it went right up until the next deadline, which was the day that President Reagan was inaugurated as Carter's successor. Um, the work we did there, which took a while. I mean, the White House kept wanting us to get involved. The State Department kept saying, we don't need amateurs helping, but eventually got to the point where the State Department had to admit that there was no one left in Iran that they were able to talk to. And so they said, all right, well, if you can be helpful, please be helpful. Meanwhile, the Iranians, we had all these Iranian students who were well connected to the revolution, which was very exciting for them. And we'd been asked officially several times to be helpful. And so we, in the summer of 1980, we had a series of conversations with people like the Ayatollah Beheshti, who was head of the Islamic Republican Party, and the Ayatollah Rafsanjani, who later became the head of everything.
Yeah.
And they were remarkably straightforward conversations. They were perfectly happy to think through the structure of a deal. And one of the first things we did was create a little piece of paper that had victory statements for the Ayatollah Khomeini and for President Carter. We'd put the victory statements on both sides of a piece of paper and we'd give it to people. And it didn't matter which one they read first. They'd nod and said, yeah, that sounds pretty good. And we'd say, well, turn it over. And people would turn it over and they read the other side. And inevitably they would get very puzzled and start flipping it over and say, but wait, these both sound good. How can that be? And he said, that's the point. You find a solution when both sides can declare victory because they have somewhat different interests. They have some interests that are shared, some that conflict, some that are just different.
Well, that's if I may interrupt. That was one of the lessons I remember from getting to Yes, is the idea
yes,
of separating the interest from the people.
that's exactly right. And the solution to that problem was they if they argued over how much they could extract from the other side,
Right.
they would never reach an agreement. We said they needed a principle. And Iran, we asked the Ayatollah Beheshti, is Iran asking for more than that to which it's entitled? And the Ayatollah Beheshti said, well, no one ever asked for more than they think they're entitled to. Well, let's talk about the merits, right? And both sides could live with that statement, even if they disagreed about what each side was entitled to. If that was the framework, they could have a reasonable discussion about what the standards were. And even though, based on our work, as far as we can tell, the Ayatollah Khomeini issued a statement dropping the demand for an apology, and the Algerians said they'd be prepared to mediate, and they worked out the details, but the structure of the agreement came from that thinking. And the lesson, whether it's for Congress or anything else, is you have to put yourself in the other side's shoes and look at their choice. And your job as a negotiator, as anyone who wants to get something done, is to serve up choices to people that are more attractive than doing nothing.
Mm.
And that's the business of politics. That's why even people who didn't agree with him, thought Ted Kennedy was such a great legislator. You go to half of Congress and you say, this is a real problem, I want you to do something, and they make a speech. That doesn't get anything done. You went to Ted Kennedy and said, we need to do something about this. He said, well, you won't get it done without somebody from a farm state, and you're going to have to give them, something they won. Probably the best person would be this, and you're going to need somebody, on this committee as well. Let's see, the person who might be interested would be this, and they're going to need this. That's how you put a deal together.
But let me digress for a second, just on that statement that you said. I want to hone in on it. You have to present people an option that looks better than doing nothing. And I'm thinking I'm not trying to be partisan here, but we all know that part of the dysfunction of the Congress in recent years has because we do have seemingly a do nothing caucus that does want to do nothing. And I was listening to an long format interview with Nancy Pelosi recently when she was talking about her book. And one of the quotes that struck me was how do you negotiate with someone who doesn't want anything? And do you see that as a particularly recent challenge that the Congress faces? That we do have a caucus of people that are just the no caucus that just don't seem to want anything other than something that's, incredibly outrageous that is frankly not reasonable or, more than is fair from just an outsider's perspective.
The reason I started with Iran is that everybody said these people are crazy. You can't, how do you negotiate with people who are crazy? And they didn't turn out to be crazy at all.
Hmm.
Um, in terms of understanding politics from their point of view and the things that they believed in. We have some people in Congress who say things like, the government's too big. We now have people in the White House saying our government is too big and it's too slow and it's not controlled by the people. And there's a lot of truth to that. You only have to look comparatively at how bureaucracies can work and how you can get things done, or just at the gap between the intent of much congressional legislation and what comes out the other end with bureaucrats who are worried about being criticized if they, you exercise discretion to see that our government isn't working as well as it should. On the other hand, you have people who, are looking for their next career and are raising a lot of, their job is to raise money, and saying outrageous things allows them to raise a lot of money. And we're in a, a period when that is a very viable strategy for a lot of people who are in Congress. The members that I talk to think that the largest caucus in Congress is the mushroom caucus, the people who are kept in the dark and fed shit by leadership.
I'm sorry, I haven't heard that term, but I have to agree. I thought you were going to say the centrist, but okay, we'll go with mushroom. That's fine. But in talking to, and you and I both have an unusual front row seat in talking to members of Congress and staff in ways that the American public and indeed reporters don't remotely have access to.
Yeah.
And we do know that the vast majority of Republicans want to get things done and are great public servants and really want to
Yes.
serve their constituents well. And I say that to my Democratic friends, and they think I have two heads, but it's the reality. These people are public servants, by and large. Most of members of Congress, one of the shocking things that you realize when you work with Congress, most members of Congress are decent human beings, just having different views on how to
They
get things done.
came to get things done. And
Yeah.
you mentioned the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. The members of that committee showed up at meetings again and again and again, to the absolute amazement of staff who'd never seen so many members in the same hearing. Usually they come in just to make their statement, and there's like one chairman, and they come in, they come out. They actually came and talked. They talked to the witnesses, they talked to each other. They had more fun on that committee and felt better about the work than anything else they did in Congress. And they all said that in the final meetings, because they felt like that was why they'd come to Congress, was to solve problems.
Well, that's the next area I want to go in. First, I want to do a quick history for listeners who may not be familiar with the Select Committee, because when we talk about it outside of Washington, I'm sure you experienced this. Nobody knows it existed, right? It's still a bit of an anomaly. So the Select Committee was created in 2019. Derek Kilmer, great congressman, Democrat from Washington, was asked to chair it. He had some conditions. One of them was it was an equal number of Democrats and Republicans. He changed the title from ranking member for the minority member to vice
Vice
chair, which is
chair.
where it was pre 95. And any recommendation had to get a two-thirds majority. And to the amazement of everybody on the outside, they put out over 200 recommendations. One of the most significant one was bringing back earmarks, which the Appropriations Committee adopted, both Democrats and Republicans. But there's a whole host of other recommendations that came out of it. But there's one anecdote I want you to recall to the extent you can, because it's a shared moment for you and I. In March of 2019, you and I found ourselves in a little room in the Library of Congress, Jefferson Building, beautiful vista looking out into the Capitol. And it was the first retreat of the Bipartisan Select Committee on Modernization. You were asked to be one of the um, facilitators. A CMF facilitator was also, Congressional Management Foundation facilitator was also there. I told them the price for that would be I get to sit in the room and watch. So that's I was one of only, I think I was the only outsider other than
I think
staff that
so.
was, beside yourself and our consultant that was there. Um, and over the next 6 to 7 hours, what you facilitated and what I witnessed was one of the most extraordinary displays of collaboration, brainstorming, and
Yeah.
cooperation that I've seen in my 4 decades in working with the Congress. I know you're under confidentiality rules anytime you're working as a facilitator with a client. Although it's no secret that you were there, to the extent can you just describe the scene and without giving any details of who and what was that day like?
The thing that's overwhelming, they almost all came, all of them who could come. One
Yeah,
person who had to leave actually came back, which literally staff fell out of their chair. There was just huge energy. And the energy was to focus on what they all came to Congress to do, and all agreed they spent almost none of their time actually doing. The second thing is it was really difficult on any substantive issue we talked about to tell a Democrat from a Republican.
yeah.
And I had to know. We did the work in mixed groups, as you would in facilitation, but the reports, it didn't matter who was reporting out. There weren't, they don't spend their time talking about problem solving, and particularly not about how Congress works. They just didn't have ideological disagreements.
I remember looking at the facilitator guide before the retreat, and I was wrong about something. There was the first thing they were going to do was a 45-minute icebreaker. And I'm like, there's no way 14 members of Congress are going to do a 45-minute icebreaker. They're just not that kind of animal. They
Yeah.
want to get stuff done. I was dead wrong. They spent 45 minutes, and each one was asked why they came to Congress. And what struck me, as you pointed out, didn't matter if you were D or R. They all had stories of public service, of
Yeah.
desire to improve their human condition for their constituents, for their state
Yep.
and the nation.
Yep.
And their motivation was remarkable. And in that moment, the first thing I think that you and I probably witnessed was that they did realize that they were all coming at this from the same perspective as public
Well,
servants.
that is an insight. That's probably the most important and profound insight that we have had across all of our meetings with members, with leaders of these organizations that send us the most partisan letters for fundraising and things that we get. We are bringing very diverse, ideologically different folks together in private sessions among in and outside of Congress and experts as well. And in every case, I think the dynamic that we can see in those few places or just in the public when they talk to each other, they start with policy, they disagree violently, and I think the conclusion that everybody leaps to is you couldn't disagree with me that strongly and be so wrong if you cared about the same things I care about. And that assumption, same in the US public, as far as every actual in-depth, research that I've seen is just wrong. And so what we do in our groups is we start at the other end and say, what do you not like about the situation that we're in? And what are your aspirations for America, right? What really animates you? And tell us your personal story of why that has meaning for you. And people are always in the same place. I mean,
Yeah.
they may not have exactly the same emphases, but they just say yes, 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 and they understand each other. And that leads to a pretty clear understanding. It's not about where we're trying to go. To the extent we have differences, it's in what's the best way to get there. And do we have confidence, in one way or another way? And some people might say you have confidence in bureaucrats to get us there. Well, probably none of us do. But is there about, how can you produce checks, balances, whatever it takes? It's about how to get there. And that's gotten lost for a variety of reasons. And you got a bunch of people who are saying, no, sort of basically my job is to leverage the power of government for my personal gain. And whether you're inside or outside of government, if that's, if you go back to, I guess, Kennedy's question, if you're asking what government can do for you, that is going to get us in trouble. If you can
I would
ask,
interject also personal gain. I think in many of these cases, we're talking about a very small group of people in the United States Congress that is causing dysfunction. Personal gain might be just straight ego trips. They're doing this is how they
sure,
get their yayas off, is that they go on cable TV and, they're the
yeah,
show horses, not the work horses. You mentioned your meetings a minute ago with members of Congress. I skipped over something in your bio. I made a mistake. You are a co-founder of the Rebuild Congress Initiative. Can you talk a little bit about Rebuild Congress Initiative and the work that you've done in the last few years in these meetings with members of
yeah.
Congress?
Yes. De Tocqueville argued, as have many other political scientists, that the American system doesn't work if the presidency is too strong and Congress is weak, because the presidency is an either-or choice. And the dynamic then is to offer a choice, right? To be different in some way. If the president is the be all and the end all of what happens, the choice can easily get to feel existential, as we have certainly experienced people feeling in the last few rounds. Likewise, if Congress doesn't step up and deal with the most difficult political questions, there's huge pressure on the courts to take on these political questions,
Mm.
which creates incentives to appoint judges based on how you think they're going to rule instead of appointing the people who are the best jurists. I mean, the law has a long history, and it works much better when you appoint the smartest, most subtle thinking people about what precedents really make sense in the history of the common law,
Mm.
not people who have an agenda. And the result of existential presidential elections and politicized courts is loss of trust in our institutions and loss of community, and maybe loss ultimately of the republic itself. Um, and so the Rebuild Congress initiative was really me coming out of my international and corporate work and saying it was time to get off the road. My wife calls it rewiring, and saying, but I still want to focus on something important. And I've studied how you transform dysfunctional organizations. And Congress, by that view, is the most important, the most dysfunctional, and the most complicated organization around. And when you look at efforts that have been made to fix it, they fall afoul of a small handful of key process insights that we've developed over the years at the Harvard Negotiation Project. Like, I'll give you two examples. One rule of thumb we have is you can't rule anything out. No matter how toxic it seems, you have to follow the logic of the problem wherever it goes. And the second thing is you can't figure out a system from the outside. You have to involve people who are in it.
Yeah.
Complex systems have a lot of hidden factors. One of our sort of rules of thumb was until you really push the system, give it a really hard push to try and change it, you will not even begin to understand it. And you can know that you're making some progress when something comes literally out of left field. You didn't see anything like it coming, and it tries to assassinate you as an interventionist. Then you feel like, oh, now we're getting somewhere. And you begin to see what are the hidden factors that keep the system in place, because it's only when you try and change it that they can become visible. Except that, looking at Congress, the members of Congress, they can't always articulate what those factors are. But if you have them try on, a potential change that's very concrete, and imagine they're living in it, when they get uncomfortable, right? You know you're onto something, and if you work at it, you can often sort of tease out what they're worried about and begin over time to reverse engineer what might be going on. But that actually goes back to the other answer I had to your first question. In South Africa, it's kind of interesting. When Mandela got out of jail, he looked around and he said to a colleague of his, we're drowning in third parties who are trying to be helpful and they, collectively aren't. And he had this guy do a systematic study of people who actually might be helpful, and he came up with two groups, one of which was ours. And
Wow.
we trained the government and the African National Congress and all the smaller parties in negotiation process, and then ultimately persuaded Mandela and others that they needed facilitation for good process in the constitutional process they were going to have, and persuaded him because he said, I think our process should only be South Africans, and you can't find any neutral South Africans. So how do we have facilitation? And we said, you actually really don't need somebody who's neutral. You just need someone who's mostly impartial and whose personal incentives are aligned with success.
Hmm.
He said, that's interesting. And he said, who do you suggest? And we said, you ought to be able to find 15 people from the business community who
Ah,
you think are smart and creative, because even though they like capitalism and they have, their overriding concern is to avoid a civil war. And there must be 15 that you trust enough, given that you're not giving them any power to decide anything. And they thought about that, and they came up with a group, and we trained them. And what they
wow.
did, because I think the National Party thought that this process would take at least 10 years and they didn't have to worry about change. And in fact, they came up with a new constitution in 2.5 years. And while there were some bumps, they had Codessa 1 and Codessa 2, and then, sort of, they were around a very small set of political issues. But if you look at it, these parties came into the beginning with fundamental disagreements on which they'd taken public positions and written monographs on everything. There were parties who said we ought to have a unicameral legislature. Another one that said, it should be bicameral, and there was a tricameral position. There were positions about a presidential system or a parliamentary system. I mean, very well articulated views. And almost all of those issues were resolved in the first iteration of Codessa. And when you ask people who were there, well, how did you decide you were going to have a presidential system and a bicameral legislature and this, that, and the other? They said, well, we didn't really negotiate that. Well, what are you talking about? Well, we had these working groups, and the
Wow.
facilitators, they put on the table all the different proposals one at a time, and they never asked us to accept anything. They just asked for criticism. And when people criticized, they'd sort of dig in to articulate what the interests were and the fears. And they'd do that until you could sort of understand why people were worried. And that didn't persuade you to accept that option, but it helped you understand what a good option would need to satisfy. And where there were conflicts, they'd say, okay, that's what you want, but what do you deserve? How do you manage conflicting rights? What principles ought to apply? And that was a
It's
really,
interesting to transplant that notion of working groups back to the Select Committee on Modernization. One of the things that we observed early on is Derek Kilmer appointed working groups. And so
yes,
you had, and it was based on interest. So, Congressman William Timmons, a Republican from South Carolina, and Congressman Mark Pocan, a Democrat from Madison, Wisconsin, were really
yes,
worked up over the schedule. They just
yes,
wanted, they just were just
they still are.
they still, yeah, they still are because it's not solved yet. But the point was they want, and so they worked together as a team in developing a reform scheduling system and brought it to the broader committee. And because you had now two internal champions who are now advocating for it, it made it more likely for it to happen. And
Yes,
I thought that was a fascinating, and it doesn't surprise anyone to know that the chairman, Derek Kilmer, was a former facilitator himself. He was a McKinsey consultant, and it certainly showed in his leadership and stewardship of that committee, where 90% of the time he wasn't Chairman Kilmer, he was Facilitator Kilmer. And
Right.
that's
And
what,
I mean, we did give him a little bit of advice. He was very good at taking it and making it fit the process they were doing.
bringing
So,
us back
and
to the, I want to bring us back to the
well,
Congress.
let me
Okay, go
finish
ahead.
the story because it's relevant there. I mean, what people said was we didn't negotiate that. We talked through the options, and in the end, we just agreed to do what made sense.
Hmm.
But they didn't realize the degree to which their sense of what made sense had changed as they understood what other people were worried about and as they'd sort of thought through how these things. And in the end, they agreed to do something that was a little different than what anybody had proposed at the beginning. They had modified the proposals in each case to take account often of what the outlier, right? You got seven people saying this is the right thing to do, and one person saying it's a disaster, we should never do it. If you take that eighth person seriously and tease out, what are you imagining might happen? They always give you a scenario. And usually the reaction of everybody else is, I don't think that's very likely, but fair enough. That wouldn't be a good scenario. We should avoid that. And then you tweak the proposal in a way that makes it impossible to have that scenario. Well, I can't tell you how many times I've seen that scenario in retrospect proves much more likely than others might have thought. And the tweak makes it work, and you get the eighth person on board.
Yeah.
So with that, so the two lessons were look at how you make progress quickly. Look at concrete proposals and ask people to try them on, but don't ever ask for acceptance. Just ask for criticism. And that's exactly what the select committee did again and again and again. They looked at concrete options. They didn't ask for acceptance. They said, what would be wrong with this one? What would be wrong with this one? And as Timmons said quite recently, he says, I don't think there's almost anything we set out to do. We didn't find a way to do if somebody was really committed to it, but we often didn't do it in exactly the way that was first envisioned.
Hmm. Interesting. Interesting. Let me bring us back to the United States Congress for a second, and have you tease out what are some of the core challenges the Congress faces to becoming a more collaborative and successful legislature. And they can be internal, they could be external. But how you've now had almost a decade now of working with the Congress. What do you see as the core challenges to being a more
Yeah.
collaborative institution?
Well, again, I think what we need is a strong, independent, functional, and representative Congress in order to make our system work. And we have almost the opposite of that. We don't have people with compromise, even bipartisan, problem solving is considered bad politics and often a dirty word. I asked a group of congressmen a couple of weeks ago, I said, look, if Congress is simply going to rubber stamp what a president of the same party does and reflexively oppose what a president of the opposite party does, why do we need it?
Yeah.
And they couldn't agree more, frankly. They understand we need a Congress that can make up its own mind and that doesn't feel like they'll all get voted out if they do that.
Mm.
So they talk about, we need committees with clout that really
Yes.
do work, and not all the clout in the chairman, even. If
Right.
you got members who want to go some other way, you want checks and balances, but you want real power in committees. That may mean that you need, an independent chair of the Rules Committee so that votes aren't just scheduled for political reasons.
Heresy, Bruce. Heresy.
I know. And they said there was sort of one name they could come up with. If you put Thomas Massey in charge of the Rules Committee, you'd get votes on everybody's amendments. He was the one guy. They said, no, he'd really probably do that. Although, who
Wow.
knows? We're a long way from that, and it has a lot to do with, I think, there's no silver bullet, right? This is a
Yeah.
very complex system that's developed over time, but certainly partisan primaries are something that pretty much everybody thinks is a problem.
Yeah.
I was told that Marjorie Taylor Greene essentially won her first primary with 8% of her
Yeah.
electorate voting for her. But once you win the primary, you will win the general election.
Yeah,
And
just
the
to put the
people who
numbers
went,
associated with that, and this happens in many states and in many districts, you're basically allowing about 20,000 people
yes,
to elect a member of Congress to a district that represents 750,000. And that is
more,
happening in district
762.
after district,
Yes,
which is why people feel their voice doesn't matter on some levels. Because guess what? It really doesn't
it
sometimes.
really doesn't. You
Yeah.
you only are working to you want to make sure the activists don't get on your bad side because they'll run somebody to your flank.
Yeah.
And that makes it even worse. So that's clearly a very big issue. Beyond that, George Washington and like many of the framers had a lot of insights about sociology that have since been supported by really good research that they didn't have. But George Washington, for example, was a big proponent of no more than 30,000 people being represented by a member of Congress. Now, functionally, that doesn't work too well because that means we'd have 11,000 people in Congress.
Yeah.
But the research shows that if you are in a group that size in a community and the community faces a serious problem, you have a reputational market, and the group will put forward someone who's well qualified to deal with the perceived problem. When you go above that amount, the group will put forward the person who's most attractive, tallest, deepest voice you want to have a beer with, but doesn't have much to do. There's not enough close connection. And I think we have not figured out a way to have the representative part of Congress work. So, our system also requires localness. If you're going to have a strong Congress, that has to mean that you feel more connection with your local representative than you do with the president or someone else. And with 762,000 constituents, we don't have a way to do that. There are ideas. I mean, there are some people who make it work. They have a lot of town halls or teletown halls, and they have a way of talking to people that builds connection. Some people build networks that work. There are things that probably can be done, but we don't even have the British Parliament has a nonpartisan organ that tries to explain what's going on in Parliament to the electorate and give them information about the
Hmm.
issues and the arguments, and just at least if you're interested, you can try and get into the nitty gritty without too much trouble. We have nothing like that. The only
Yeah.
outreach of the US government is the Agricultural Extension Service. But
I
you
was
could have,
I was in a focus group some years ago when I worked at the Congressional Management Foundation, and it was one of those classic, you're on one side of a one-way mirror and you're watching eight people talk with a
yeah,
facilitator, and they were talking about what information they wanted from their member of Congress to make them feel more connected, to understand what was going on. And this project was about building better websites. And it was really fascinating. I was amazed. The Congressional Management Foundation showed two websites to these constituents, and I came from the public relations world, so flashy and
yeah,
pictures and colors. That was my world right back then. And they showed a website that was flashy and with photographs and graphics and all that kind of stuff. And they kind of went, oh hum. And this is back in the early days of websites. And they showed another website that I would have called boring, but he had a link to how he voted, explanations of how he voted, and
yeah.
information on how his positions on the issue. And one one person in the focus group said out loud, "I'd vote for that guy." And I realized I had this aha moment, and I was remember talking to a member of Congress about building a
Right,
better website, and he had a great quote. He said, "Oh, I get it. I don't need to think like a politician. I need to think like a librarian."
right.
And when you actually do drill down, when the public is hungry for that. One of the things that's developed,
Yes.
and I was in a previous podcast was talking to a member of Congress about the advent of telephone town hall meetings, And you and I both know that Professor Michael Neblo at the Ohio State University has done some tremendous research, some of it in coordination with the Congressional Management Foundation, where, you know, thousands and thousands of people can participate in these things and they feel great about them and they increase trust in government and they lead to more people voting in the
Yes,
next election.
that's
So
right.
there are some solutions out there that do trust and build trust. But let me go come back to the Congress for a second because you have had this insight in looking at and really I'll put you on the spot here for some specific recommendations. You know, what sort of recommendations I know you did say we need internal champions as well as external champions, but you know we all know that internal champions rely on experts outside of Congress. What sort of recommendations do you think would improve collaboration and civility inside the institution?
Um, yeah, I think I've already mentioned the one that matters the most, understanding and acknowledging on both sides that we, for the most part, do want the same things.
Hmm.
We are arguing about the best way to do it and not assuming that people are lying about the data and not lying about the data, but actually bringing the data that is persuasive to you. Not probably doing all of that in public all the time.
Right on.
Uh,
Yeah.
Generally, uh, the hearings that are most persuasive to the public are the ones where both sides have agreed on what would be educational, right? Um, and there are only a few committees that plan together and work together, although the select committee was one of them. Um, those are the kinds of procedural things that make a difference, but it goes against the incentives that people are feeling right now. You've got the president saying explicitly, "You cross me, I'll primary you." Elon Musk will spend $100 million in your primary, and he's only got to bring out an extra 2 or 3 thousand people, and you're
Wow.
going to lose. That's again. I mean, I think the measure is you should feel a much stronger connection to your representative in Congress, your representatives in the House and the Senate, than you should to the president. And I do not believe that's true for most people today.
I
It
think you
did used to be true.
I think you also drew out an issue that I've certainly observed in 30, 40 years, and that is the incredible election worry that just wasn't as ever present in the mid 1980s or 90s. And I think one of the factors that has contributed to this, of course, is the close margins in the House. That it does matter who the majority is, and the election will determine it. You know, we've had the election flip 4 or 5 times, which is only the second most volatile time in American history. The other time was right after a civil war. I think the other factor that I've noticed that has been a contributing factor, and I would go so far as to call them the villains in this play, is the leaders of the party reelection committees, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee and the National Republican Campaign Committee. And I talked to members of Congress
Yeah.
who are in, you know, so we say purple districts that are, you know, marginal districts who want to collaborate with other members of the other party in similarly marginal districts. And the leadership will come to them, other House members, their colleagues will come to them and say, don't work with that person across the aisle because we're going to target her in the next election. And I would argue that I think that is another factor that we have to weigh in. I mean, it just you didn't have that happen in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, where you had leadership intervening and preventing collaboration happening when membership wanted to
Right.
collaborate in a constructive way.
In all kinds of ways. I mean, the close majorities has meant the focus is on winning the next election. That has led to, I think, pretty straight line, a consolidation of power and leadership so they can
Yeah.
control message, avoid tough votes, make things more partisan, and in the end, sideline members. I mean, I remember in our original interviews, the board member who said, I came here to get stuff done, and frankly, I feel like a potted plant with a plastic card for voting.
Yeah.
Yes, the people, that's why it's the mushroom caucus.
Well, Bruce, I'm going to wrap things up there on that negative note, unfortunately, but I want to thank you so
Well,
much for your
but
time.
let me say one thing that
Yeah, please do.
maybe I won't attribute who it came to, but a guy on the right who came to Congress really wanting to shake up the government. And when he came, they won the House. And he went to leadership and said, "What are we going to do that's big and really sort of in the direction of what we all say we want to do?" And he was told by leadership, "Well, we can't do that this session because we want to win the Senate." Well, lo and behold, they won the Senate. And he said, "Okay, now we got the House and the Senate. What are we going to do? Congress is the most powerful." He said, but we want to win the presidency. And then they won that too. And he went and he said, "All right, now we can do something big and important." And they said, "Oh, no, that would jeopardize keeping power." And he said, "Look, if the point of getting power isn't to do something, why does it matter?"
Yeah.
And I think that's a very profound insight because I think people haven't answered the question. Ezra Klein talked about the number of Democrats he brought on the program and said, "Okay, look, if Harris wins, what's your number one priority for going forward?" And it's like, "Oh, I don't know."
Wow.
Well, then, no wonder you're not getting elected.
Yeah, that is again such a significant frustration. I think that most people on the outside, like you and I, see time
And
and
it
time
does
again.
give a sort of a leg up to people who are just arguing about tearing it down. And sort of one of the things people talk about inside the Beltway is, Republicans know how to criticize, but then can't quite figure out what they want to do. And
Well,
Democrats talk about not tearing it down, but then they don't change much in the status quo and when it's not working. And why wouldn't people get upset?
well, Senator Mitch McConnell said famously, "Any ass can kick down a barn. It takes a carpenter to build one."
Yes.
And I think that's unfortunately in some cases, and I regrettably, it's some of those donkeys, shall we say, and I'm not talking about Democrats, who do get all the attention on the Sunday shows and on the cable shows. But you and I
Yeah.
both know that there are workhorses out there. There are decent people in the institution.
And it means one other point I think we should put on the table before we leave. This is not all about electeds. The incentives and the expectations also come from the electorate. To some extent, there are people who argue, and I think there's an argument to be made that we've gotten the government we asked for.
Yeah.
We stopped civic education. We have people who are acting like sort of spoiled kids who, if you don't get what you want, you expect parents to give you what you want. If you don't get it, you want to try and sort of overturn the regime. And psychologists can tell you about that, but we need people to remember that rights always need to be balanced against other rights and balanced with responsibilities. And because we were founded in opposition to a king who we thought was authoritarian, there was this focus on rights, but the responsibilities go with it.
Well, that's a great way to close things, I think, Bruce, with that lesson. And thank you again so much for your time and your insights into helping to make a good Congress. Good
You're
luck with
very
you and your
welcome.
work, and good luck for the rest of the week. Take care.
Thank you, Brett.